The insurrection at the Capitol was unprecedented. Multiple congressional investigations are now underway about how it all happened.
Yes, but concerns about the policies and transparency with Capitol Police now, that dates back years. Today, Scott McFarland and the News 4i team shed some light on a police force that has largely been operating in the dark.
He's one of the thousands who labor inside the U.S. Capitol each day, handling maintenance with the architect of the Capitol's office. So Ololade Odiale says he was surprised when he left work one night, got in the car, and got pulled over by Capitol Police.
I've never been humiliated in my life. I've never been disgraced, embarrassment.
Odiale says police told him there was a problem with his license plates.
He said, "Are you sure you work here?" I said, "This is my building right here. I work right here." Then he said, Nah. He handcuffed me.
He says they held him for 4 hours before letting him go. But Odiale can't let it go, saying he was mistreated and that months later he couldn't get a copy of the police report to clear his name.
I just want to report it. I want everybody to know what's going on.
Ryan Davis felt the same.
Officer comes out of nowhere with his gun drawn to my face.
The longtime Capitol worker says police drew their weapons when they say he failed to stop at an ID checkpoint last summer. His lawyer disputes the police account, but says for months the Capitol Police have refused to hand over surveillance video, which would prove it.
So there's security cameras everywhere, and there's evidence that would be dispositive of the issue.
Even an attorney can't just ask for the relevant video?
You can ask, but they're going to tell you no. That they withhold information and evidence very close to the vest, the U.S. Capitol Police.
For years, people on the Hill have credited the nearly 2,000 officers for their work on the front lines, but criticized the agency leadership for operating in the dark. Unlike your local police department, U.S. Capitol Police do not release reports or records. And in the first week and a half after the insurrection, they held no public briefings. They didn't speak with the News 4i team either.
I will tell you, we're having a hell of a time getting information from the Capitol Police.
Tim Ryan isn't just a U.S. congressman. He runs the powerful subcommittee that oversees and funds Capitol Police.
We, I think, deserve to know and understand what the hell is going on. And it's a black box over there.
Because the Capitol Police answer only to Congress, they don't have to follow many of the laws other police do, including the Freedom of Information Act. And because members of Congress come and go, so too does the pressure for change. But even before the recent riots at the U.S. Capitol, there have been concerns raised about access, including because of this man. Doug Hughes flew a gyrocopter from Florida, landing on the Capitol grounds back in 2015 as a political protest. Hughes says he warned police he was coming, yet seemed to catch them by surprise. A congressional committee ordered the U.S. Capitol Police chief at that time to appear at a hearing days later to explain. Hughes says police need to explain publicly how it failed this time, too.
I was astounded that they completely dropped the ball and left Congress exposed.
In each year since, Congress has boosted the police budget, including by another $54 million in 2021 to a total of nearly $500 million a year. Last summer, including language that police should do a better job of informing the public about major security incidents and any misconduct by officers. But just 2 weeks after it became law, the insurrection upended the Capitol.
Without a means to get information from them, there's no way for the public to have a check and balance on their police powers.
A police force now facing new cries for more transparency amid a security crisis that's led to new fencing and metal detectors at our nation's capital. Scott McFarland, News 4i.
1 month and 1 week after the U.S. Capitol insurrection, more than 200 people are facing charges in connection to this horror. But an investigation by the News 4i team reveals most of those people are back home with family, even back at work as they await their day in court. As Scott McFarland reports tonight, the handling of these defendants is raising some questions and fueling perceptions of a double standard in who gets arrested and released.
When the terror ended and the tear gas faded, it came time for some of these faces to face justice. Aaron Mostovsky, who allegedly seized a U.S. Capitol Police shield and helmet during the riot. Larry Brock, who the feds say invaded the Capitol armed with zip ties. Then there's Matthew Capsule, who allegedly roughed up National Guardsmen. And Riley Williams, who prosecutors say stole a computer from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office with plans to sell it. to Russia. They're among hundreds arrested after the insurrection. Some have pleaded not guilty, others awaiting their court date, but they were all set free to await trial back home. D.C. activist Ron Moten was kept in pretrial detention when he was arrested for selling drugs in the 90s. Moten believes race is a factor in why so many alleged insurrectionists are being released.
This is the root of institutionalized racism that many of us have been talking about for decades.
Jesse Ennis was kept in pretrial custody in 2008 before serving time for armed robbery in St. Mary's County. Now she works for the criminal justice nonprofit.
I can honestly say that if that was people of color, black people that had done that, the outcome would have been vastly different.
Our News 4 I-Team review of U.S. Justice Department and U.S. court records shows pretrial detention is increasing in America, up from 50% to 75% of all criminal cases in just recent years. But of the nearly 200 U.S. Capitol riot cases, we found about 15% of those arrested have been kept behind bars awaiting trial. So what is the difference in this case? Is it race? Is it the type of crime? Is it the money some of the defendants have? The News 4 I-Team wanted to know.
It's almost impossible to believe that race is not the driving factor.
Former Department of Justice official Jonathan Smith said the factors judges use to consider whom to hold in custody, like prior convictions, jobs and housing status, or community ties, tend to favor white or more affluent people.
All of those factors weight very heavily in a racialized way because of other, economic and racial discrimination factors in our country.
But the I-Team found the feds have made it hard to know for sure. A review of federal justice reports of all crimes found pretrial detention is most common in drugs, firearms, and immigration violations, and that black and brown people are held at higher rates than whites. So we asked the Justice Department and the U.S. courts for racial disparity data and who gets detained for these types of charges: violent entry, assaulting police, and civil disorder. But they didn't provide it, nor is it easy to track.
You would think that we would have a plethora of data on people, in particular people that we as a government are responsible for because they are confined in our facilities.
Charisse Fano-Burdine runs the nonprofit Pretrial Justice Institute and says the courts don't track this the way they should.
It's almost one of those, if I don't count it, if I don't keep the track of it, maybe it's not a problem.
She suspects a racial disparity is happening, but doesn't think more people should be detained.
That treatment that we're seeing white people get is actually the treatment we're supposed to all be getting, which is a presumption of innocence.
The Justice Department declined multiple requests over the past 3 weeks for an interview about this issue or these cases. In several court hearings we reviewed, prosecutors did ask for some restrictions for insurrectionist defendants: GPS monitoring, mental health screenings, even prohibitions on defendants using the internet. Moten says this is a different experience than most accused criminals in the district have, though.
Which tells you the tales of two stories in America.
The rioters came to D.C. with frustration and anger and have left behind a different type of frustration and anger for others in their wake. Scott McFarland, News 4 I-Team. Many of the barricades are removed, and more than 100 suspected insurrectionists are now being criminally charged. But for U.S. Capitol Police and National Guard protecting the Capitol, one risk is still growing. Quarantined to a room in a Crystal City hotel, a Virginia National Guard member is positive for COVID-19, symptomatic, alone, and nearly 100 miles from home.
The fact that so many of them are coming down with COVID, testing positive for COVID, and not having adequate medical supplies or medical care or nutrition, that's what concerns me.
His wife is bringing him care packages and keeps his spirits up. She asked we not show her face or use her name because her husband is not cleared to speak with media. You think some of this was avoidable, or some of this could have been prevented?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The soldiers in close proximity to each other for so long. The fact that they are working very long shifts and they're very tired.
He's not alone. Her husband told her 20% of the 600 people in the Virginia Guard unit have now tested positive. In total, as many as 200 Guard members deployed to protect the district during and after the Capitol insurrection have tested positive for COVID-19. And a union official tells the News 4 I-Team at least 38 U.S. Capitol Police employees have tested positive just since January 6th. The protocols and social distancing they've been told to employ were just impossible to employ during a riot and assault.
So the fact that these men and women uprooted their lives, part of their job as Guard, means that we owe them an obligation to make sure that they're safe.
Their families worry guard members were exposed while resting in less than ideal locations, like a parking garage or on the marble floors inside the Capitol complex.
As a military spouse, my heart broke.
Members of Congress say they've asked for better accommodations for the remaining guard members to prevent further spread.
I can only hope lessons have been learned that since these troops are going to be here for another several months.
If they're going to continue to be deployed, some of them through March here at the Capitol, that they ought to be high on the priority list on getting vaccinations.
As for this Virginia wife, she knows her husband will remain alone for 2 weeks. She's worried about his health and the care he and others are getting while sick.
I just keep thinking, these men and women, they just deserve better. They really deserve better. They've given so much.
Meanwhile, Capitol Police officers tell the I-Team they're lobbying the agency for more vaccinations more quickly. They think they're still exposed, working in a complex with members of Congress who fly in regularly from all across the country. Scott McFarland, News 4 I-Team. Sandra Garza says she met her best friend and boyfriend of 11 years online, just as he was joining U.S. Capitol Police.
He made everyone feel comfortable and safe, I guess is the best word. He just was very warm, gentle.
They shared a military background, and she says Brian Sicknick, a World War II buff brimming with patriotism, wanted to keep serving the nation.
He loved his job. He had a lot of pride in that.
As the chaos began January 6th, she and Sicknick texted and took that as reassurance he was safe as she headed to his house to feed the dogs they'd shared together when they lived together.
So I actually was 5 minutes from the house when I received a phone call.
Another Capitol Police employee told her Sicknick had suffered an emergency. With a police escort, she raced to the hospital in Washington, D.C., but would soon realize it was too late.
We did not get to hold his hand or say goodbye.
COVID restrictions limited access to her and his family.
It was very hard to not be able to see him and say goodbye, and it's just horrible. It's something that nobody should ever have to go through.
The medical examiner ruled Sicknick died of natural causes, suffering 2 strokes after the insurrection. According to prosecutors, some in the mob sprayed him with a heavy dose of chemical spray, overwhelming him. There is video of the attack, and Sandra says it took her months to bring herself to watch any of the images of the mob. You didn't want to see video of that insurrection?
No, I did not. I had heard so many horrible things about it. And also I was afraid of seeing him in any of the footage.
But she has been seeing quite a bit of the Capitol. Along with some of Sicknick's colleagues and mother, she visited senators urging they support an independent January 6th commission.
The anger is driving me to take action for Brian. It's how I'm coping with it.
But there weren't enough votes. She says some senators gave her the brush off. Others refused to meet. What would they say to you? How would they tell you no?
Well, some of them would say that they felt it was very partisan, it was one-sided, and that's why they couldn't vote yes for it.
She hopes House leaders plow ahead with their own review to get answers about why the National Guard was so late to respond that day and what gave rise to such horror. How so many, including former members of the military, could turn on their country.
I wish that he could have had a much more peaceful last moments on this earth. And it hurts me a lot that he didn't get that. And knowing that, my gosh, you know, his own fellow Americans were doing this. That's the worst part about it all, too.
Landon Copeland spent 17 months in Iraq, a sergeant who saw combat and won service medals. Copeland says he served his country proudly. So how did it come to be this dad and vet from Utah is accused of joining this attack against his country January 6th? Prosecutors say Copeland assaulted police on the front lines that day. He is yet to enter a plea in his case. But from his jail cell in his home state, Copeland told me by phone he doesn't believe he committed a crime.
The president invited the people to be there.
Copeland acknowledges he was there that day and did confront police, and that he was motivated by the political rhetoric and news and arguments he'd been reading on social media.
I haven't had a TV in years. The only way that I got my news was through social media.
The only way.
Yeah.
According to a News 4 I-Team review of the more than 500 defendants charged in the Capitol insurrection, dozens are military veterans.
I think you've seen an escalation in purposeful messaging towards the military and the veteran community.
Jeremy Butler of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America says though some Americans might be surprised to see vets among those arrested from January, he was not.
I think misinformation is one of the biggest problems we're dealing with in a country, regardless of the topic that you're talking about. Definitely applied to January 6th.
A report from a U.S. House committee in December alerted to a unique and growing threat, targeting our veterans online. Not just to target the vets for political propaganda, but to convince those veterans to spread it.
I think you see people trying to take advantage of the fact that our country is pretty united around the military veteran cause, and so people will try and use that to their advantage depending on whatever their ultimate goal is.
The report shows multiple posts, often on Facebook, pushing divisive language and images, including from some groups, the report says, use the names of legit organizations or that were operated outside the U.S.
Experts tell the I-Team it's largely foreign actors targeting military veterans for this political propaganda, but they say those efforts didn't stop at the 2020 election.
The Stop the Steal campaign was not an organic thing. It was not a sudden thing that came out of nowhere. It was highly organized.
Christopher Goldsmith would know. He says he's a veteran who suffered PTSD and began consuming misinformation online.
It's not that they're targeting veterans because they're vulnerable. They're targeting veterans because they're influencers.
As a veteran, I am more likely to influence my immediate social network. I'm not talking about like Facebook social network. I'm talking about my friends and my family.
Goldsmith now investigates the spread of misinformation among veterans, and in a 200-page report he wrote, he urges the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to educate veterans better on how to avoid foreign propaganda online.
Those images are effective.
It's pretty effective because Americans respect veterans so much, as they should. Americans have a high regard for veterans.
California Congressman Mark Takano chairs the House Veterans Affairs Committee and has ordered a hearing later this month into the problem.
The committee has had a long-standing interest in terms of the ways in which veterans can be targeted.
The VA declined our request for an interview and said it recognizes vets are being targeted on social media and added it has no dedicated program or office in place to specifically combat extremism.
It doesn't mean that the overall military veteran community, is damaged, but it means that there's an issue there that we need to make sure that we're tackling.
Even Landon Copeland tells us he knows bad actors are out there targeting veterans.
There's almost positive that there's PSYOPs campaigns that are run across social media.
It's an online battle aimed at dividing this country more than we already are. He once fought in a war zone overseas with the U.S. Army, but Aquilino Gonell says he never felt the fear or saw the sights he did on January 6th.
We wanted to preserve the Constitution. We wanted to preserve our country and our democracy.
When he was on this front line at the West Front Tunnel of the U.S. Capitol.
Did this seem more dangerous than Iraq?
Oh, yeah.
Interlock the shields! Lock them together! Lock them together!
Inches away and face to face with the mob and shoulder to shoulder with the rest of his police riot team.
It looks, from the images, like it's claustrophobic.
It's claustrophobic. You have the tear gas, the bear spray, the fire extinguisher, the fire alarm system going off, the yelling that they're doing.
For hours, he says they held the line, preventing the rioters from breaching another entrance, which we later learned was just steps away from where some members of Congress were hiding.
But inside the tunnel, I asked myself the same question again and said, where's the military?
Hours after the cloud lifted and the crowd retreated, Sergeant Gonell realized something else was wrong. He was injured, and seriously. A thrown speaker device crushed his foot, and a stolen riot shield and police baton ripped into his shoulder and right hand.
I'm working with through physical therapy. I had 2 surgeries already.
9 months later, he's still off the job, trying to recover physically.
My right thumb still hurts.
We've learned as of late this summer, at least 10 officers remained off the job with injuries sustained that day, Sergeant Gonell included. We've also learned between 75 and 100 department employees have left the job since January 6th, many due to retirements.
Sergeant Gonell says these are signs of the continuing consequences of the riots. In addition to the daily reminders to him of that day, as case after case goes to court, he says he's growing increasingly frustrated by what he considers light penalties.
This was not just an attack on the police officers. This is an attack on our government, the seat of democracy.
Our latest review of the court filing shows the feds have reached plea agreements in nearly 100 of the 630-plus federal criminal cases from the insurrection. A large majority of that first wave of plea deals are to misdemeanor charges for those not accused of damage or assault. And as we've reported, a number of those charged with these less severe crimes have faced probation, home detention, or jail sentences of less than 1 year.
You have what you need to try to flip those defendants against the bigger fish.
Former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner has heard similar criticism about the sentences, but says it's not uncommon for the feds to close out lower-level cases first and then build evidence and build momentum for the harsher charges.
You have to make some hard decisions about which one to resolve early with relatively low-level pleas and which ones to make sure you focus on.
As for Gunnell, he's focused on one thing, he says.
I don't even know when I'm going to be able to go back to work.
The day he'll be able to return to his job, knowing there's still a long road ahead.
It's like injuries of war.
Yes.
It felt like a war, I bet.
Trial by combat.
To heal from this battle that happened on the home front. Heading to work each day at the center of American democracy, Renata Becca-Barragan dreamed about this.
The work that we put in and the long hours that we put in, it's going to make other people's life better. That's really what drives me.
But this moment for Renata and so many of her colleagues has not been so dreamy. Threats against members of Congress have doubled since 2020. Lawmakers and their employees are under fire out in the community. And then, January 6th, the nation's capital under siege. Lawmakers, workers, their staff trapped inside.
I think, the risk is in the back of your mind, but it became very clear, on that event.
Becca-Barragan is one of 4 congressional staffers who sat down with the News 4 I-team to talk about that day.
Show of hands, anybody get frantic text messages from their mom or dad when they shut down the Hill?
And how life has changed after it. Marlon Debuson says he now pays closer attention to the security alerts.
Every time I've gotten one of those alerts, I've immediately messaged anyone who's up there asking if they're okay, just because you don't know, how serious it is anymore.
The staffers all work for different members of Congress in different parties from different parts of the country. But they agree the insurrection was the culmination of an increasingly toxic political environment, affecting more than just the lawmakers.
Doesn't matter what your politics are, what party you're in. And in fact, I think I've gotten more threats from people of my own party than the other one.
They say it was also just the start of a year where threats felt closer than ever. A metal detector installed off the House floor to check members for weapons. A truck bomb threat that forced evacuations, and an ongoing search for a person police say planted pipe bombs nearby. All while working through a pandemic.
It is relentless.
Sharon Nichols, a longtime U.S. House communications aide, was in the Rayburn building getting her COVID vaccine when the riots began. Like Marlon, she locked herself in an office and watched it unfold on television.
With flags, with metal objects that you knew they had not gone through the metal detectors, it was horrifying. It was shameful. It was scary.
I think the scarier thing wasn't necessarily seeing what they were holding in their hand, but what do they have under their shirt, under their jacket.
You ever reflect upon all the evacuations this year? All the threats of bombs, explosives, and say, I didn't expect I signed up for this.
It's an honor to serve, and there are also risks that come with it, and I think we've seen that this year.
Renata said she keeps comfortable shoes under her desk now, just in case.
Be ready to run when you have to.
And the question is, will all of this convince the next generation of the best and brightest to run in a different direction, to stop coming to our city and our community to serve the public? Does anybody know someone who left their job because of this year? 3 of you do.
I think they just didn't want to be part of something that was where the tensions are so high and options to do anything about it can be limited.
I think it's a mix of everything, just how charged the environment is and, all the division and all the risk.
January 6th was just the final boiling point.
Members of Congress have formally acknowledged new challenges recruiting and retaining Hill's staff as Congress maintains a strict cap on member staffing levels and on their budgets.
Anybody here think they can make more money in the private sector than they make doing this job?
Is my boss going to see this?
Why this then, Marlon?
You know, just the tangible results that you get from it. You're directly helping people.
Since our conversation, Brandon Ware has taken a new job in the private sector, but said stress on the Hill isn't why.
Despite everything, it's still an incredible opportunity and great work.
In the months following the insurrection, Congress raised the salary cap for top staff and has proposed increases to office budgets and boosted employee mental health assistance programs that help members improve security, even at their home district offices. Changes designed to keep more staffers like these on the front lines of service.
We get the chance to shape the laws of this country. I mean, and it's a great responsibility.
A responsibility, they tell us, is still worth the new risks. In the earliest minutes of the riot on January 6th, it wasn't the sight, but the sound that stands out to U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn.
When I heard that initial distress call for they breached the line, we need more units, and the person's voice is a friend of mine, and I heard the terror in their voice, the fear in their voice.
Dunn ran to the west front of the Capitol.
And that's where I got my first glimpse of the mob
approaching and attacking.
You couldn't see any grass. It was all covered by people from the Capitol as far down Pennsylvania Avenue as you could see. It was just people. And they were coming towards us.
Using bats, sticks, poles, and bear spray.
What's bear spray like?
Hell, can I put it like that? I mean, when it hits you, you can't breathe. And because if you do breathe, you're breathing in this chemical that tears your insides.
The rioters injured more than 100 officers that day. Dunn says he was lucky, suffering only bumps and bruises, but the trauma of that day has stayed with him for nearly a year.
There were times when I would eat lunch in my car just because I didn't want to be around people, and I was just isolating myself and just... There were times when I would just cry. I would physically cry and just say, why the hell am I doing this? Like, is this even worth it?
Dunn grew up in Prince George's County and played football at James Madison, then in the Canadian Football League, before making a big shift, choosing to serve his country, protecting the citadel of democracy as a Capitol officer.
There's a proud group of men and women that I work with.
But this year marked another shift for Officer Dunn, from officer to advocate. He has spent this year lobbying for an independent commission to investigate this unparalleled American horror, and he testified publicly about what happened here January 6th to counter the sea of lies and conspiracy theories.
If a hitman is hired and he kills somebody, the hitman goes to jail. But not only does the hitman go to jail, but the person who hired them does.
He testified at a July hearing of the House Select Committee investigating the insurrection.
How has life changed for you in the year?
It's still changing. I think every day is changing.
The spotlight has taken its toll. He's celebrated on social media, including by top government officials, but it's also made him the target of racist words and memes on extremist message boards.
They created a noose, a gif of me in a noose the day of my testimony. And then you got people that had the nerve to say that I'm lying, exaggerating about the things that I went to.
And amid that mob that day, Dunn says he and other black officers faced racism.
I'm not saying that January 6th was a racist event. I don't believe it was about race, but there were a lot of racist people there.
Some rioters using racial slurs and more.
When we saw the gallows, and then we saw things ranging from, anti-Semitism, we saw, racist remarks being made, and probably most importantly, the Confederate flag flying for the first time.
Adding another layer of horror that day, says Dr. Ray Winbush, the director of urban research at Morgan State University.
Black folk look at it as being an indication of the continuing racism in this country combined with so-called patriotism, and we see the results of it.
And I was right back at 7 o'clock in the morning.
The next day?
The next day.
Dunn and many of his fellow officers barely had time to understand what happened.
I'm not over it, and like I say, I don't think you ever get over it, but some of my coworkers are still out, and some of them are still suffering with psychological effects, and that bothers me.
He too says he's still in therapy. and also watching the cases of those charged.
I am going to continue telling my story and my truth. That's all I can do. I can't worry about what people choose to believe.
For this officer, it's a new way he's found to protect and serve.